In the paradisiacal Antilles of the Caribbean Sea, there is a beautiful island of multiple colors, dreamy beaches, and fertile fields, full of hardworking and cheerful people who have witnessed victories and tragedies in the ups and downs of history and power. Before the famous revolution with which Fidel Castro proclaimed the socialist state, the island of Cuba was led by for more than 2 decades Colonel Fulgencio Batista. Batista led a period of economic and social development on the island, in which Cuba emerged as one of the most prosperous and visited nations in the region. It was also a period of intrigue, corruption, and mafias in a country that was never supported by the North American power. Then the same state supported the revolutionary guerrillas, and in the events that ended up overthrowing him and sealing the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. Today we are going to learn about this story, each day more blurred by time. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia. And I remind you that you can give us great support to continue doing this work simply by leaving your comments, liking this video, and sharing the material with all your acquaintances. Below you can also get a link. Nothing more to add, let's get started. Fulgencio Batista was registered at birth as Fulgencio Batista was born registered as Ruben Saldivar in Veguita in January of 1901 in the current province of Holguin on the island of Cuba as the eldest son of a very humble and very austere Catholic family. In his family there were Spanish, Amerindian, Black, and even Chinese ancestors, which is why he came to be nicknamed the Indian or the Mexican. His father was a soldier in the Cuban Liberation Army who fought for independence from the Spanish kingdom, a Mambi as these independence guerrillas were often called. Fulgencio was raised a few kilometers from an important plantation of the wealthy Castro family, where 20 years later a boy would be born who they would call Fidel. From the age of 8, Fulgencio had to work in various trades to help his siblings, such as a sugarcane cutter or tailor's apprentice. With little formal education at 15, he was orphaned by his mother and ran away from home, living for several years in near destitution. Beyond this, Fulgencio was an enthusiastic reader and had a very charismatic and eloquent way of expressing himself. But before continuing with Batista's life, it is necessary to mention the life of Cuba. Since the mid-19th century, various groups in Cuba unsuccessfully rebelled to gain independence from the Spanish crown. In 1898, after 3 years of war between the Cuban independence fighters and the troops loyal to the crown, the American battleship Maine explodes under strange circumstances, and the United States, which was consolidating itself as the hegemonic power of the hemisphere, blames the Spanish and declares war on Spain. The United States defeats the Spanish in Cuba and gains control of the island. The Americans militarily occupy the island and begin negotiations with the Cuban independence fighters. In 1900, at the call of the military government in Cuba, under American command, a constituent assembly is elected that approves a new Cuban constitution that establishes a liberal republican regime. But before granting independence to the Cubans and militarily leaving the tariffs for their producers, they take 70% of the sugar production, appropriates huge amounts of land that are sold to American companies, and favors their investments in the railway sector and in mining exploitation. Similarly, it makes various amendments that Cuban delegates adhere to, such as the famous Platt Amendment, which gave the United States explicit and constitutional right to intervene on the island whenever it deemed necessary, and also restricted Cuba's foreign policy. Finally, on May 20th, 1902, the Republic of Cuba is proclaimed, with limited sovereignty under American surveillance. Batista's birth coincides almost with the birth of this young republic, which, not exempt from political conflict and new American interventions, the island experiences significant economic and social development in the following decades, with movements and presidents who did everything possible for Batista, who at the age of 20 in 1921 makes a decision that would impact not only his life, but that of the entire Caribbean island. He buys a ticket to Havana and joins the Army of the Republic of Cuba in 1921. By 1923, he enters the Rural Guard, and with his hard-working and obedient attitude, he would eventually reach the rank of stenographer sergeant of the Army General Staff, from where he would gain prominence and followers within the armed forces and establish friendships with high-ranking military officers. He alternated his military career with the study of journalism and would eventually also dedicate some time to teaching. From the 20s and 30s, nationalist, socialist, and revolutionary groups proliferated in Cuba, raising flags of transformation and a new constitution for Cuba. Batista is affiliating with these groups, while the president of Cuba, Gerardo Machado, reforms the constitution to be re-elected, but is overthrown in 1933. A provisional president is installed. With intelligence and charisma, Batista had managed to win the leadership of a group of military men who, along with other political sectors, signed a manifesto demanding the drafting of a new constitution to replace that of 1901, where the controversial Platt Amendment was constitutionally embodied, among other elements opposed by Cuban sectors. After deliberations and intrigues, in September of the same year, 1933, the so-called Sergeant's Revolution takes place, which counted on Batista as one of its main leaders and with the support of other sectors of civil society. A 5-member governing board was formed, which was called the Pentarchy and chaired by the prominent civilian Ramon Grau San Martin. Faced with the need to stabilize the situation of the armed forces, one of the members of the Pentarchy, named Sergio Carbó, decides to promote from sergeant to colonel the man to whom thousands of army soldiers de facto responded, to Fulgencio Batista. Other promotions are distributed, and Batista is appointed as the chief of the Cuban army. With this, Batista consolidates himself as the strongman of the armed forces, from where he would consolidate himself in the future as the strongman of the entire island. In parallel to all this, a focus had developed of military officers who did not recognize the new government and rejected the Revolution of '33, also supported by the ambassador to Cuba, Ramon Grau, and Batista. However, Batista and Grau end up crushing the rebels. In October of that same year in the Battle of the National Hotel. In this way, the country was militarily stabilized, and a new political period began in Cuba in 1934 with Batista as the head of the army. Politically, these were vigorous and tumultuous times. Batista had the task of ensuring public order and also to socialists and communists who were living in the country. Several provisional presidents came and went between 1934 and 1940, it is said, under the shadow control of Batista, who cunningly developed a good relationship with the United States ambassador. Within this framework, thus, Cuba continued to experience considerable socio-economic development, not without problems such as the great dependence on the sugar industry or the monopolization of some sectors in few or American companies. As head of the army, Batista inaugurates in each province the superior technological centers and the civic military institutes, specially designed to educate young people with scarce resources from the island. By 1940, with Batista being one of its main promoters, a constituent assembly is created, which was a historic flag for the island, with participation from various and respected sectors of Cuban politics, from Republicans to communists. In June, the new constitution was approved. Thus, universal suffrage was established within the era. Universal suffrage was established within a new parliamentary model, a social safety net and public services were created, and a welfare state for the most disadvantaged. By 1940, President Federico Laredo Brugo resigns, and Batista sees the opportunity to no longer be the military power behind the scenes, but to reach the presidency of the Republic. After many years of amassing a network of followers and friendships in high politics, Batista resigns as head of the army and presents himself as a candidate of the so-called Socialist Democratic Coalition, which grouped together liberal, nationalist, unionist, and communist groups. It is here when he changes his name to Fulgencio Batista, as at his birth the father had denied the child to put the Batista surname. In this way, Batista was elected on October 10, 1940, as the first president of the newly approved Constitution. During Batista's first term, Cuba experienced significant economic and social improvements, and his figure received great popular support, while the institutionality of the young country was strengthened. Exports increased considerably, reaching $450 million in 1944, while the government built new roads and schools and invested in agricultural mechanization and the start of a significant light industry for the island. Public education, public services, and credit institutions for the lower classes existed in Cuba prior to the current official narrative. It is true that a large part of the population lived very austere and frugal lives, as was characteristic of rural life at that time, but under material conditions that were gradually improving, as was happening in all countries that were integrating into the modernity of the 20th century. In turn, during this first government of Batista, just like the entire American hemisphere, Cuba, as an ally of the United States, declared war on Germany, Italy, and Japan in 1941. Similarly, in 1942, Batista formed diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union, a member of the Allied bloc. By 1944, as stipulated by the Constitution, new elections were called in which President Ramon Grau San Martin was elected. After Batista's official candidate lost, his faction moved to the opposition. This was something the American ambassador would denounce, saying that Batista was causing problems for President Grau. In an environment of hostilities and threats, Batista went into exile in the United States, where he said he felt safer. Batista divorces his wife Elisa and marries Marta Fernandez in 1945. In the United States, 2 of his 4 children would be born. After Fulgencio's departure in 1944, there followed 2 presidential terms in Cuba, from which allegations of corruption and especially inefficiency and ineffectiveness in the running of the state emerged. It is important to bear in mind that during these decades, Cuba had 2 predominant political parties, the Authentic Revolutionary Party, led by Ramon Grau San Martin, and the Orthodox Party, led by Eduardo Chivas, both parties of a leftist, anti-imperialist, and nationalist nature. In the youth of the Orthodox Party, there was a young law student named Fidel Castro, who had started his political career from the world of student politics at the University of Havana. During these years of American exile, Batista remained connected to Cuban politics, and in 1948 he was elected to the Senate of Cuba, but in absentia. He would not return to the country yet. With the permission of the Cuban president, in 1949 the Unitary Action Party was founded, with Batista as its public face. A party that brought together liberal and conservative elements, but moving away from the socialist tendencies that had characterized Batista's first government coalition. This in the context of the period of maximum tension of the Cold War and the alignment of the governments of the Western Hemisphere with the foreign policy of the United States. By 1951, Batista is authorized to return to the island and begins to make public life again with his party, which he renames the Progressive Action Party, to run again for the presidency of Cuba. In these upcoming elections, the victory of the Cuban Orthodox Party seemed imminent, and the polls placed Batista in 3rd place, but Fulgencio still had the support of the National Army and various political and union groups. Faced with a panorama of political conflict and facing the possibility of a defeat, and instigated by his circle of allies, who saw in the 2 main political parties an unbreakable hegemony, Batista leads a new coup 4 months before the elections, taking power on March 10th of 1952. Not a single drop of blood was shed in the coup, and protests were scarce while others applauded. Batista deposes the acting president, Carlos Prios Ocaras, cancels the elections that were 4 months away from taking place, and is proclaimed as provisional president until new elections are held. Upon his return to power as provisional president, Batista creates a council of ministers that replaces the legislative and constitutional powers. His government receives recognition from the United States, as well as support from liberal, conservative, union, and landowning Cuban sectors. Although he had a sometimes tense relationship with the U.S. government, he still received financial, logistical, and military support under the Truman and Eisenhower administrations. However, as we will see later, contrary to what is disseminated by conventional history, the United States would later turn its back on him to support the Cuban revolutionaries. Returning to July 26, 1953, a year after Batista's coup, a group of revolutionaries, many from the youth of the Orthodox Party, led by Fidel Castro, who had become convinced that armed struggle was the only possible way against Batista's government, carried out the famous assault on the Moncada barracks, a military barracks located in Santiago de Cuba, assaulting that and two more barracks. The government's military forces suppressed the rebellion without much problem, although they suffer several deaths. The subversives are spared their lives when they are captured and imprisoned, while others manage to flee the country. Batista declares a state of exception, suspends constitutional guarantees, and establishes constitutional statutes that suspend the Constitution of the 40s. Fidel Castro becomes a public celebrity after the assault. He is sentenced to 15 years in prison, but 2 years later, in 1955, he receives an amnesty from President Batista. Upon being released, Castro founded the 26th of July movement, a group for armed struggle with a Marxist core that brought together various revolutionary movements of different ideological tendencies, but they all had in common the goal of overthrowing Fulgencio. In that year, Fidel Castro goes into exile in the United States to seek support, resources, and weapons for his cause. It's important to note that Cuba in the 40s and 50s was a relatively prosperous country in contrast to the average Latin American country. Its gross domestic product per capita in the 50s was equal to that of Italy, and the country was the center of important infrastructure and development projects at the time. During Batista's second government, the Cuban economy maintained slow but steady growth. Batista took charge of protecting property rights and the smooth operation of American industry and Cuban trade. Wages for Cuban workers in the industrial sector significantly increased, although they deteriorated in other sectors. By 1958, Cuba had the 8th highest industrial wage in the world, according to the International Labor Organization. During this period, numerous infrastructures were also built, such as the Havana-Baradero Highway, railway lines, expansion of the Rancho Balearos Airport, and the tunnel under the Bay of Havana. On several occasions, Batista rejected personalism and asked for his portraits that had been hung in important buildings to be removed. On the other hand, a good part of the population, especially in the countryside, continued to live in a very modest and precarious way. A third of the population was recorded below the poverty line, although with material standards that continued to slowly improve in relation to previous years. At the same time, there was an increase in chronic unemployment that reached around 15%, and more than half of the population had problems accessing drinking water, electrical services, and housing with good sanitary conditions. Likewise, monetary reserves fell from $448 million in 1952 to $373 million in 1958, and by the year 58, the budget deficit reached $800 million. The Cuban economy was very dependent on sugar, so in an attempt to diversify the economy, Batista and his government promoted tourism, achieving notable results, although intensifying the already old trend of Havana to serve as an enclave for business of entrepreneurs and members of the American mafia, who with various tax incentives invested a lot of money in the business of nightclubs, hotels, prostitution, the casinos, and drugs in Havana, acting as a sort of vice paradise for foreign tourists. The names of the mob bosses Meyer Lansky and Luque Luciano are well known, among those who established lucrative business relationships with President Batista. Havana came to be known as Latin Las Vegas. During this period, numerous protests from student union and socialist movements also emerged, which were repressed numerous times in the name of public order. When the opposition engages in armed struggle, execution is resumed as a method of government punishment, while restrictions are applied to the media. A year after the coup d'etat, Batista calls for elections on November 1st, 1954. Batista would run as a candidate for a coalition of his Progressive Action Party, the Radical Union Party, and the Liberal Party. The opposition considers participating or boycotting the elections. Former President Ramon Grau withdraws a few days before the elections, denouncing the use of fraudulent measures. With a participation of 52% of the population, Batista comfortably wins the elections and takes office on February 24, 1955, restoring constitutional guarantees and the validity of the 1940 Constitution. Simultaneously, in 1955, in the United States, Fidel Castro is received at the headquarters of the Council on Foreign Relations, the most powerful research and lobbying group in the United States, chaired by the magnate David Rockefeller. The master of ceremonies for this meeting would be Agent William Wieland. This would be one among other key meetings that would provide the necessary political and financial support for the expedition that Fidel Castro was preparing to overthrow Fulgencio Batista. Not in vain, Nelson Rockefeller, another magnate of the family and future Vice President of the United States, would express in 1958 his best wishes for the success of the Cuban Revolution. But this is a story for another video. In the years 1955 and 1956, amid allegations of corruption against Batista, the political situation begins to stir following various student protests and the emergence of armed groups such as the July 26 movement. The University of Havana was the main focus of socialist movements and other revolutionary trends that opposed Batista, in addition to hosting armed organizations within it, which is why the university was closed on November 30, 1956. In April of 1956, the military man Ramon Barquin, who had returned to Cuba at the request of Batista himself, carries out an attempted coup d'etat, but fails due to a leak of information. For his part, Fidel Castro, with the financing received in the United States and by other Cuban actors in Mexico, returns to Cuba in December of 1956 with 82 armed members to invade the island in coordination with other internal revolutionary elements. But the landing fails, and the few survivors, among them Ernesto Che Guevara and Raul Castro, retreat to the Sierra Maestra, where they begin to recruit new fighters and start a guerrilla war against Batista with Fidel Castro as the chief commander. In the guerrillas' arsenal, there were weapons of American origin. In turn, by March of 1957, another group of armed revolutionaries tries to take over the Radio Reloj station and the presidential palace to end Batista's life. The few military forces present at the location manage to defend the palace long enough for Batista to escape with his life. Days later, hundreds of thousands of people come out to show their support for President Batista. After the coup attempt, Batista carries out an internal purge of the armed forces, but this ends up weakening the internal cohesion of the same. Generals like Eulogio Cantillo would continue to conspire against him. In the midst of this, journalist Ever Matthews enters the scene, who would later become the director of Latin American Affairs for the United States Council on Foreign Relations. Ever Matthews, in the midst of the conflict, manages to interview Fidel Castro on the island, an interview that is published by the prestigious New York Times, a medium also associated with prominent American banking groups. The images and the interview go around the world, presenting Fidel and his guerrillas within a romantic narrative of David versus Goliath, of the fighters seeking democracy and social justice against a tyrannical military and oppressive dictatorship. Thanks to this press work, Fidel and the guerrilla cause become global phenomena with the support of international public opinion. Amid internal and external protests and guerrilla warfare, after having been its ally during his term in March of 1958, the United States announces that it would stop selling arms to the Batista government. Months after this, the United States doubles down on pressure against Batista and decrees an arms embargo against the Cuban government. Meanwhile, American diplomats on the island let Batista know that his time is running out and that he must soon leave office. At the same time, differences arise between several generals of the armed forces and President Batista due to disagreements regarding military planning and the army's operations to combat the guerrillas. This, coupled with the generals who start to switch sides and conspire against the president. On May 24, 1958, Batista sends 17 battalions against the guerrilla rebels in Operation Summer, but the revolutionaries manage to resist the attacks and continue their advance. With the end of the presidential term approaching, Batista calls for new elections for 1958 and nominates his own official candidate. Ramon Grau, just as he did in 1954, withdraws from them, denouncing fraud. The elections are held in November of 1958, and Andrés Rivero Agüero, Batista's candidate, is elected. The Venezuelan government of Wolfgang Larrazabal, who overthrew President Marcos Pérez Jiménez, also with the consent of the United States, sends weapons to the Cuban guerrillas to support their fight. By December of 1958, the support of the de facto powers that had sustained Batista had substantially diminished, primarily that of the United States and a sector of the armed forces that conspired against him, led by General Eulogio Cantillo. On December 28th, the militias commanded by Che Guevara carried out an attack on the key city of Santa Clara in the center of the island. Faced with increasing isolation and at the demand of some conspiring generals, Batista decides to resign and escape to Santo Domingo along with the elected president. General Eulogio Cantillo is left in charge of the country, but in a fragile state. The guerrillas were not the main ones responsible for the overthrow of Batista, but they would know how to take advantage of the subsequent situation. Fidel Castro rejects this new government of Cantillo with the slogan of "Revolution yes, coup d'etat no." He calls a general strike, orders the guerrillas to continue the fighting and advance towards Havana, now without an armed force to resist them. Insistence, Fulgencio Batista was giving a final speech before leaving. Taking into account the loss of lives, the material damage to property, and the evident harm that is being done to the economy of the Republic, and praying to God to enlighten the Cubans to be able to live in peace, I resign my powers as President of the Republic, handing them over to my constitutional successor. I urge the people to maintain order and avoid being thrown into passions that could be disastrous for the Cuban family. The next morning, on January 1st, the guerrilla troops of the Second National Front of the Escambray enter Havana. A day later, the troops of the 26th of July movement arrive. Commanded by Camilo Cienfuegos and Che Guevara, they detain General Eulogio Cantillo. Shortly after, the troops of the Revolutionary Directory, another guerrilla group, occupy the presidential palace, causing an internal dispute among the revolutionary forces. In parallel, on the same 1st of January, Fidel Castro arrives in Santiago de Cuba and declares it the provisional capital of the Republic. The revolutionary groups proclaim Magistrate Manuel Urrutia Leó as the new president of the nation and to Fidel Castro as the commander of the armed forces. Thus, a heterogeneous government is formed that is officially recognized by the United States, thus sealing the end of the Batista regime. The revolutionary trials, confiscations, and the way Fidel Castro is displacing other moderate sectors to consolidate himself as the sole leader is a story that will come in another video. Batista leaves the country with money and goods valued at more than $2 million. First, he arrives in the Dominican Republic, where President Rafael Trujillo offers him troops, weapons, and money to regain power in Cuba. But Batista refuses, then he decides to go to Portugal under the protection of Prime Minister Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, and finally ends up settling in Spain under Generalissimo Francisco Franco, even though in the 40s Batista had expressed quite disparagingly of him. There in Spain, he continued to maintain close contact with anti-Castro forces, although without any success for his plans to recover the island. In 1973, Fulgencio Batista, protagonist of Cuban events for 2 decades, dies of a heart attack in the town of Marbella. His remains would rest in the San Isidro Cemetery in Madrid, next to his second wife. With Batista, a generation of displaced Cubans would end up dying, who with their lights and shadows built a Cuba very different from today's Cuba. After more than 60 years of the revolution in power, there are few Cubans still alive who experienced this Republican era in their own skin, part of a history that has been fading but refuses to die. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you liked it, and don't forget that it is very important for us that you can subscribe to the channel, leave your comments, share the video, follow us on our Instagram account called The New Encyclopedia, and above all, that you collaborate with us on our Patreon with any help you can give us. Thank you all very much, and God bless you.